A retired soldier sat alone in a cafe until a waitress recognized his face from an old newspaper. He came in for a quiet cup of coffee, expecting nothing more than another ordinary morning. But when the waitress takes one look at his face, she freezes. She's seen him before, in a story long forgotten. Who is he? And what secret from his past is about to resurface? Before we begin, tell us in the comments, have you ever met someone with a past more incredible than it seemed? And if you love stories filled with mystery and unexpected connections, don't forget to like this video to support the channel. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. He walked into the cafe just after sunrise. His posture slightly stooped, his face etched with lines that suggested both age and memories, too heavy to carry easily. The place was almost empty at that hour. Just a couple of other patrons sipping coffee, the faint hum of a refrigerator behind the counter, and a waitress setting out sugar packets on each table. Outside, the sky was turning from gray to pale blue, the morning chill lingering around the door whenever someone stepped in. He chose a corner booth, away from the windows. A worn baseball cap cast a shadow over his brow. He wore a simple jacket, its sleeves a bit frayed, and his boots, though still sturdy, showed scuffs at the toes. He moved slowly, gingerly, like a man used to aches in the bones. The waitress, a young woman named Gina, who'd started her shift half an hour earlier, noticed him as soon as he entered. She'd seen all kinds of folks at this cafe. The early morning workers grabbing a quick breakfast, the retirees seeking quiet coffee, the occasional exhausted traveler. But there was something about this man that caught her eye. Maybe the quiet way he scanned the room, or the tension in his shoulders. She grabbed a menu, a coffee carafe, and approached him with a polite smile. Good tips weren't likely from early customers, but she always tried to be friendly. He looked up, meeting her gaze. His eyes were a warm brown but carried a distant quality, as though some part of him remained elsewhere. She smiled and slid the menu across the table. "Good morning," she said quietly. "Coffee to start?" He inclined his head in thanks, voice barely above a murmur. "Yes, please." She poured him a cup of steaming coffee, noticing how his hands tensed around the cup, as if he struggled with pain or memories. She didn't press him. Some folks weren't ready for conversation. She simply told him the specials for the day and moved on to check the other tables. He nodded absently, not opening the menu right away, gaze drifting to the table's surface as though lost in thought. It was a typical beginning for a solitary customer, and Gina went about her routine. But every so often, she cast a glance his way. A faint sense of recognition tickled the back of her mind, as though she'd seen his face before. Not at the cafe, she was certain, possibly in a photo or old newspaper. Gina had no idea why the thought came. The lines of his jaw, the shape of his brow, something about them nudged her memory. She tried to dismiss it. She'd seen countless faces in magazines or on local TV segments. People sometimes looked like someone else. Maybe it was just a small resemblance. He sipped his coffee slowly, after which he flipped open the menu. He settled on something simple: scrambled eggs, toast, bacon. Gina returned to take his order, noticing he spoke politely, but that his voice trembled almost imperceptibly. She guessed he might be older than he looked, or that he had some health issue. He said, "Thank you, ma'am," each time, with the courtesy of a man raised in a strict environment. Something told her he was likely a retired serviceman, maybe from the posture and the habit of scanning the exit. But it remained a guess. She kept it to herself. She passed the ticket to the short order cook in the back. The cafe was quiet, only the soft crackle of the grill and the low murmur of a radio. Outside, the street traffic began to pick up. Gina carried out a refill of coffee for him. He offered a nod in thanks, meeting her eyes for a moment, then lowering his gaze. She studied him briefly, that sense of recognition sparking again, stronger this time. She recalled how her father used to collect local newspapers, especially stories about veterans or events from the nearby base. Could this man's face have appeared in one of those articles? She let the thought stew while she grabbed silverware for another table. He reminded her of a clipping she saw as a teenager, something about a returning soldier who'd been honored for saving lives overseas. There had been a photo of a younger man in uniform, shoulders straight, eyes proud, but haunted. Gina remembered being struck by the sadness in that soldier's eyes, even as they pinned a medal on his chest. She tried to conjure the details. Yes, it might have been an article from 8 or 9 years ago. That soldier had a distinctive scar near his left temple. Gina pivoted, sneaking a look at the man in the booth. Under the brim of his cap, she couldn't see that side of his face well. When his food was ready, Gina retrieved the plate. She approached, determined to see if there was a scar. As she placed the plate before him, scrambled eggs steaming, toast lightly buttered, he happened to tip his head up. She caught sight of a faint line of scar tissue near his temple, half hidden under the cap. Her heart gave a small jolt. This had to be the same soldier she'd read about in that old newspaper. She couldn't recall the name, but it'd been a local story, praising his heroic actions in the Middle East, something about saving members of his unit from an ambush. Then he'd vanished from the public eye, or so it seemed. Gina's father had lamented that local heroes often sank into anonymity once the headlines faded. Should she mention it? She hesitated, uncertain if he'd appreciate someone dredging up his past. He'd come here for quiet, after all. But a gentle curiosity drove her. She lingered a moment, giving him a chance to speak, but he merely murmured thanks and started to eat. She retreated, letting him have his meal in peace. Once in a while, she stole glances, noticing how methodically he cut his food, as though trained by discipline. Another memory from that article flickered in her head. The soldier had been recognized for valor, but returned with injuries that required a long recovery. Possibly the reason behind his carefully measured movements now. Halfway through his meal, she ventured back to check if everything was okay. He paused, nodding that it was fine, no complaints. The cafe was nearly empty, so she felt bold enough to speak quietly. "Sir, I hope you don't mind me asking," she said, voice low. "But have you lived here long?" The question was broad enough, not overly intrusive. He seemed surprised, glancing up at her. "I grew up around here. Moved away for a while, came back recently." His voice had a slight rasp, as though he wasn't used to conversation. He didn't elaborate, returning to his eggs. She nodded, heart pounding. She decided to push a bit further. "I'm sorry if this is too forward, but you remind me of someone I saw in a local newspaper story, years ago. It was about a soldier, a hero who saved his unit. He had a scar near his temple." She trailed off, leaving the rest unsaid. She saw his fork pause mid-air, eggs precariously on the tines. He looked down, an unmistakable tension crossing his face. She realized she might have overstepped. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, with a faint tremor, he set the fork down and exhaled. "You must have a keen memory," he murmured. "It was a long time ago. I'd rather not. Well, I don't talk about that anymore." He fiddled with the edge of his napkin, eyes still averted. Gina felt a pang of guilt for prying. She apologized softly, explaining she only recognized him because her father kept articles about local servicemen. He looked up briefly, and she saw a flash of grief or regret in his eyes. "No need to apologize," he said, voice tight. "It's just, that part of my life is over." She sensed something raw beneath his words, as though the memories pained him more deeply than she could imagine. She nodded, mustering a gentle smile, then retreated to give him space. But now she knew he was indeed that soldier from the old newspaper story. Even if he insisted on anonymity, she recognized him. The question was, what had become of him since then, that he ended up alone in a corner booth, looking weighed down by sorrow? She remembered the story praising his heroism, mentioning the injuries he sustained. Possibly, he never truly recovered, physically or emotionally. She found her thoughts drifting to how isolated he must feel if he had no one waiting for him. The rest of the morning, she left him to his meal, only returning to top up his coffee or quietly remove his empty plate. He took his time finishing. About half an hour later, he signaled for the check. Gina brought it, noticing how he counted out the exact change, plus a modest tip. As she thanked him, he gave her a quick nod, then rose, shoulders stiff. He walked to the door with a subtle limp, a testament to old wounds. She watched him go, that flicker of recognition morphing into genuine concern. But he slipped out, disappearing into the early sunshine. For the next couple of days, she couldn't shake the memory of him. She asked her father, a lover of old newspapers, if he remembered the name. Her father rummaged in his small den, eventually unearthing a yellowed clipping from 8 or 9 years ago. There it was. Local soldier honored for bravery abroad. Mark Halston returns home. The photo showed a young man, about 26 at the time, wearing his dress uniform, a medal pinned to his chest, a bandage partly covering his temple. The article praised him for saving 3 comrades in an ambush. She recognized that same somber tilt of the jaw, the same distant look in the eyes. The father described how Mark had come home to a big celebratory dinner, then sort of vanished from local coverage after. No mention of family. Gina felt sure that the man in the cafe was Mark Halston. She mulled over how he seemed so alone, something in him broken. She wondered if she should try connecting him with local veterans support groups, or if that would intrude on his privacy. She decided to keep an eye out in case he returned to the cafe. Something inside her urged her to help, to repay the sense of gratitude she felt for those who served, like her father's cousin who also joined the military. But Halston might not want help from a random waitress. On the 4th morning after that encounter, she was wiping down tables when he reappeared, taking the same corner booth. Her heart jumped. She tried not to stare as she approached, offering a menu. He nodded in thanks, ordered coffee again. This time, he opened the menu promptly, selecting an omelet. She asked how he was doing, voice gentle. He gave a non-committal shrug, not meeting her eye, though he seemed less guarded than before. She debated whether to mention the newspaper story or let it be. She chose to remain quiet, focusing on standard pleasantries. He ate in silence. After he finished, when she brought him the check, she mustered courage to say, "I remember your name from the article. You're Mark Halston, right? The soldier who saved people overseas." He froze. She thought he might lash out or deny it, but after a tense moment he exhaled, setting his gaze on the table. "I was that man. Yes, I'm not anymore." The finality in his tone stung, but she placed a hand lightly on the table's edge, not quite touching him. "You're still the same person," she said softly. "Being recognized for bravery doesn't go away, even if you try to live quietly. People around here, some of us remember. My father keeps old clippings about local vets. He respects your service." Mark flinched as though the words cut him. "I appreciate the sentiment, but it's better if folks forget that story. I came back from that war with more regrets than honors." His voice trembled on the last word. Gina caught a glimpse of profound guilt swirling behind his eyes, perhaps. She realized then that hero stories seldom told the aftermath. The nightmares, the losses, the broken relationships. She lowered her voice, ignoring the mild shuffle of another customer a few booths away. "Sometimes, it might help to share. It's not wrong if you need to talk about it. I'm just a waitress, yeah, but I can listen." She felt an impulse to comfort him, uncertain if he'd accept. He stared at her for a long moment, looking torn, then gave a tiny shake of his head. "I appreciate it, but I'm fine." The half-lie was evident. "Your father's interest in veterans is admirable, but let me stay invisible." She swallowed her disappointment, nodded, stepped back to let him pay. He left the money on the table, placing a decent tip again, muttering a polite goodbye before slipping out. She watched him vanish into the mid-morning bustle. She sensed heartbreak in his posture, an invisible chain of memories haunting him. That day, she asked her father for more info. He recalled the article mentioning that Mark lost some close friends in that ambush, that he had trouble adjusting back home. Possibly he vanished to escape pity or fanfare. Over the next week, Mark appeared almost daily at the cafe, always at the same time, always the same corner booth. Gina served him each time, offering small kindnesses, an extra lemon slice for his water, a suggestion of daily specials. Though he remained reserved, she felt an unspoken acceptance from him. He didn't bristle as much when she approached. She occasionally dared to ask how he was. He'd shrug or give a terse, "I'm well enough," but his eyes told a different story. She once glimpsed him rubbing his knee, wincing. Another day, she saw him flinch when a truck backfired on the street outside, reminiscent of gunfire. The signs pointed to classic trauma from wartime experiences. One afternoon, nearing the end of her shift, she found the cafe mostly empty. Mark finishing his meal. Summoning courage, she slid into the seat across from him, an act that startled him. She apologized if it was intrusive, but said she wanted him to know that if he needed help or resources, she could direct him to a local veterans support group that her father's friend ran. Mark stared at the table, knuckles taut around his coffee cup. After a tense silence, he let out a weary sigh, murmuring that he'd tried a group once, but couldn't handle it. Gina nodded, heart heavy. She told him about a community center that offered free counseling, said she had no right to push him, but she would at least share the info. He gave a faint nod. That was how it started, small acts of concern on her part, hesitant acceptance on his. Over subsequent visits, she learned slivers of his life, that he had no immediate family left in town, that he used to roam between states after leaving the service, drifting from one job to another. He felt cut off from people, too haunted by nightmares, reluctant to settle. Gina listened, never judging. She told him bits of her own story, losing her mother to illness, father adjusting to retirement. Mark seemed surprised to find a waitress so attentive, but something about her gentle presence eased him. She recognized in him not a stoic hero, but a wounded soul, in need of simple compassion. One morning, Mark came in limping more than usual. Gina discreetly asked if his old injuries flared up. He admitted a shrapnel fragment in his hip sometimes caused him pain. He refused her suggestion of going to the local clinic, citing that he couldn't afford more bills. She was struck by how a decorated soldier who once received a medal ended up with minimal support. She confronted her father with that frustration, who lamented how the system sometimes failed veterans. At home that night, Gina rummaged through old phone numbers her father kept, eventually finding one for a VFW contact. She kept it in mind, uncertain if Mark would accept. In small increments, Mark thawed. He'd occasionally share a memory of his service, though always overshadowed by sorrow. He explained how the ambush left 3 of his squad mates dead, and though the citation praised him for saving others, he carried guilt that those who died might have lived if he'd acted differently. Gina realized the term war hero could weigh heavily on someone who felt unworthy of that label. She responded with empathy, telling him that from all accounts, he did everything possible. He'd avert his eyes, voice thick. "Yeah, that's what they say, but it doesn't quiet my mind at night." She listened, unwavering. Over time, it became almost routine. He'd show up, she'd serve him, they'd talk quietly. The other staff teased Gina about her grumpy soldier friend, but she brushed them off. She saw glimpses of the man behind the broken shell. He had a dry wit, occasionally telling her a wry remark about how her uniform was more starched than any he saw in the army. She'd grin, retorting that maybe she should teach him how to press his clothes. Their banter felt comforting. Once, on a slow afternoon, he asked about her father, wanting to thank him for reading about local vets. She considered arranging a meeting, but Mark seemed nervous about bridging that gap, so she let it be. Months slipped by. Mark became something of a fixture at the cafe, reading the newspaper, sipping coffee, nodding at regulars. People recognized him, but no one realized he was the same soldier from that distant story. Except Gina. She never outed him. She realized that, ironically, he might have been recognized more often if folks actually remembered old articles, but time had erased the hero headlines from most minds. Meanwhile, he occasionally confided that he struggled with nightmares. Gina gave him a pamphlet for the community center's free therapy sessions. He frowned at first, but then pocketed it, a sign of possible interest. One day her father dropped by the cafe, hoping to pick her up after her shift. Mark was there, reading the local section. Her father recognized him from the article, eyes widening. Gina introduced them, not denying who Mark was. Her father thanked him for his service, voice brimming with admiration. Mark stiffened, used to feeling undeserving, but he shook the older man's hand respectfully. They ended up talking quietly about the farmland her father once tilled, about how life used to be simpler. Mark listened, nodded, offered a couple of polite remarks, then retreated to his booth. On the drive home, her father told Gina that Mark seemed decent, just weighed down. She agreed, thankful the introduction was relatively smooth. But that evening, Mark didn't show up as usual, nor the next day. Gina worried something had driven him away again. Another 2 days passed and still no sign. She asked around discreetly, but no one knew. She cursed herself for perhaps pushing him too far with fatherly admiration. Another morning, right before her shift ended, Mark suddenly walked in. She saw a bruise on his cheek, a fresh scuff on his knuckles. Alarmed, she hurried over. He tried to brush it off as an accident, though she sensed it was more. She pressed gently, noticing how he avoided eye contact. She insisted that if he was in trouble she could help call someone. He only muttered that a local bar scuffle turned ugly, but he wouldn't elaborate. She guided him to a side booth, ignoring the fleeting stares from a couple of customers. He admitted he'd been restless, haunted by memories, ended up in a bar, and lost control when someone provoked him. He mumbled an apology for staying away from the cafe, as though it was a sanctuary he felt unworthy of returning to. She told him firmly that he always had a place here, that no matter what old nightmares haunted him, she wouldn't judge. Something broke in him at that, and he let out a shaky breath. She recognized tears pooling in his eyes. He quickly turned away, swallowing them. Gina gently took a seat across from him, no longer caring about her shift tasks. A coworker could handle the few customers. She told him she was there if he needed to talk. He whispered thanks, then after a quiet moment, admitted it was time he sought real help. Over the following days, at Gina's urging, Mark attended a session at the community center therapy group for veterans. He emerged from it looking drained but somewhat relieved. He kept returning, slowly building a support system of people who understood his experiences. Gina's father quietly offered to bring Mark along to a local event honoring servicemen. Mark declined at first, but with time agreed to attend a small coffee gathering. People recognized him, praising his actions from years ago, but he managed to handle the attention without fleeing. Step by step, he integrated back into the community, though always with caution and humility. The old newspaper stories might occasionally resurface, but he learned to see them as part of his history, not a burden he must constantly escape. Meanwhile, he and Gina grew closer in daily conversations. It was an unspoken bond, a gentle affection that blossomed from the foundation of compassion. They never rushed into anything romantic, but the seeds of deeper feelings were present. She realized she was drawn to his quiet strength, and he realized she provided a grounding warmth he desperately needed. They'd occasionally share a walk after her shift, strolling down the street, talking about small joys in life. He started smiling more often, a shy, sincere smile that softened his entire demeanor. When he built enough courage, he confided more about the ambush, the guilt, how he used to see the faces of his fallen comrades every night. She listened, offered simple empathy, never trivializing his pain. One crisp autumn evening, after they parted ways at the cafe's door, he paused as though wrestling with a question. She asked if he was okay. He hesitated, then murmured that he'd be honored if she joined him at a local veterans gathering the next weekend. She found her heart skipping. She readily agreed, understanding that him inviting her was a significant step. He walked away with a half smile, leaving her heart warm under the streetlights. The day of the gathering arrived, held in a modest hall lined with flags and posters about resources for ex-servicemen. Mark introduced her to a few older veterans who recognized his name, some giving him friendly pats on the back, commending his bravery. Gina saw how he tried to hold his head a bit higher, though she could tell he remained uneasy about the praise. She stayed by his side, offering gentle reinforcement. A small group asked him to speak about his experiences. Though he hesitated, looking to Gina for reassurance, he ended up sharing a brief, heartfelt reflection on how returning home felt more harrowing than the battlefield because of the guilt and isolation. People in the audience clapped, some with tears in their eyes, relating to the raw truth of his words. She squeezed his hand afterward, proud of how far he'd come. In the following weeks, Mark's visits to the cafe no longer felt weighed down by sorrow. He walked more confidently, though he still had occasional bad days. He took up volunteering at the community center, guiding younger vets struggling with trauma. Gina saw an aura of purpose in him now. Their friendship deepened further, culminating one night in a quiet confession under the soft glow of the cafe's closed sign. He admitted his feelings for her, that her small act of kindness when she recognized him gave him hope to believe in connections again. She, tears brimming, admitted she felt the same. He was no longer just that solitary figure overshadowed by old headlines. He was someone gentle, funny, supportive, shaped by past hurts, but no longer defined by them. They began dating, if one could call it that. Mostly simple walks, coffee at her father's home, occasional trips to a park. Her father welcomed him, telling Mark how proud he was to meet a real hometown hero, though Mark still shied away from that term. He started gleaning that heroism sometimes meant living with deep wounds, but still pushing forward. Seeing her father's acceptance soothed him, bridging the normalcy he craved with the past he couldn't fully escape. Months passed, each day forging new memories. Sometimes Mark accompanied Gina on errands, helping carry groceries, greeting cafe staff with a polite nod. People in the neighborhood slowly recognized him from the old news piece, but he no longer flinched from it, thanks to the therapy sessions and Gina's unwavering support. He realized he had a stable life here. Late one evening, in a warm, candlelit living room, he slid a small ring across the coffee table toward Gina, voice trembling as he asked if she'd consider sharing that life with him permanently. She burst into tears, nodding, hugging him so tight it made him laugh with relief. They told her father the next day, who embraced them both, overjoyed. The wedding was small, held in that same modest hall where the veterans often met, officiated by a friend from the community center. Mark wore a suit, and Gina a simple white dress. Her father, beaming, gave a short speech about how small acts of kindness could yield life-changing results. At the reception, a few old newspapers were laid out on a table, representing the soldiers past. One showed that iconic photo of Mark, younger, receiving a medal. Next to it was a recent photo snapped by a local reporter, showing him smiling with Gina outside the cafe. People marveled at how different he looked now, more at peace. He gave credit to Gina for never letting him sink back into isolation. She insisted it was his own courage that allowed him to heal. Their short honeymoon involved a road trip up the coast, filled with quiet moments, gazing at the sea, exchanging reflections about the roads they traveled to get here. Returning home, they settled into a new routine. Gina continued her job at the cafe part-time, but Mark found work as a counselor at the community center, guiding other veterans through transitions. He discovered a sense of fulfillment in mentoring those who felt lost, showing them the path of healing he himself followed. Often, he recounted how a simple waitress recognized him not just as a soldier from a newspaper, but as a person worthy of empathy. That story spread among the center's members, inspiring them to look for little sparks of kindness in their own lives. For Mark, it reminded him daily that it was never too late to forge new bonds. Over the years, the cafe remained a special place for them. Sometimes on a quiet morning, they'd sit in that same corner booth where he once hid under a baseball cap. She'd bring him coffee, smiling at how different their relationship was from that first day. He'd touch the faint scar at his temple, remembering the shame and pain he carried, marveling at how compassion replaced his isolation. The local newspaper eventually ran a follow-up article titled, "Local War Hero Finds Peace and Love Back Home." They posed for a photo outside the cafe, arms entwined. Gina's father saved a copy, filing it next to the old clipping from a decade ago. The two headlines together formed a bookend for Mark's journey from lonely soldier to integrated community member, from solitary diner occupant to beloved family friend. He looked at that new article with a shy smile, neither craving the spotlight nor fearing it, simply content that his story ended not in tragedy, but in renewed hope. The rest of their life was not without challenges. Mark had relapses of nightmares, occasionally forcing him out of bed in cold sweats. Gina comforted him, sometimes urging him to talk it out or revisit therapy sessions. He still had medical checkups for his old injuries. Sometimes finances got tight, but they faced these hardships as a team, never losing sight of how far they'd come. The little acts of kindness that built their relationship carried them through each hurdle. People saw them as a symbol in the neighborhood. a quiet soldier who overcame ghosts of war, and the waitress who recognized his face from an old newspaper. They symbolized that, no matter how lost or forgotten someone might seem, empathy could guide them home. There were moments, maybe once a year, where Mark would visit the local memorial for fallen soldiers. He always invited Gina to come along, and they'd place flowers in honor of the squad members he lost. She'd hold his hand as he closed his eyes, remembering. The guilt never fully vanished, but it evolved into a gentle sadness he could bear, especially with her by his side. He'd whisper a promise to those comrades that he was living fully in their stead, making each day matter. Gina witnessed how he stood straighter each time, how sorrow gradually mingled with acceptance. In the quiet hush of a typical Sunday morning, they might be found once again in the cafe, greeting staff who had become like family. Cassie, one of Gina's younger colleagues, would giggle about how Gina used to be the star waitress, never guessing she'd one day marry that solitary man from the corner booth. Mark would grin, sipping his coffee with a newfound warmth in his eyes. He'd wave at local veterans who sometimes dropped by for breakfast after a community center meeting, offering them quick jokes or encouraging words. The younger vets looked up to him, seeing how healing was possible, how a life beyond war could be found in normal routines like reading the paper in a cafe, holding hands with the one who saw you when you thought you were invisible. And so, the lines of that old newspaper clipping had come full circle. The soldier who once sat alone in a corner booth, shoulders bowed under old injuries and regrets, had found companionship in the same place. All because a waitress recognized him from a forgotten headline, overcame the fear of intruding, and offered a small opening for connection. That newspaper was now pinned on Gina's father's bulletin board next to a more recent photograph. Mark, in a casual sweater, hugging Gina outside the cafe, both smiling widely at the camera. Next to it was a small caption. He used to hide from the world, but she reminded him it was still worth living in. Many who saw that board at her father's place found themselves moved by the quiet power of empathy. Sometimes, an older patron might ask Gina if she remembered the day she recognized Mark. She'd nod, recalling vividly how unassuming it was, a fleeting moment of curiosity, a recollection of a face in an old article. She'd say she never expected it to spark such a friendship, let alone lead to a marriage that redefined both their lives. Mark, listening nearby, would slip an arm around her shoulders, adding that it was the best recognition he ever received, better than any medal the army pinned on him. The two of them would share a small, secret smile, recalling that corner booth, the newspaper story, and the love that blossomed from a conversation that almost didn't happen. And that is how their story remained known. A retired soldier, overshadowed by war's scars, discovered hope in the kindness of a waitress who recognized his face from an old newspaper. Their journey was a testament to how the simplest act, speaking a gentle word, recalling a detail from a dusty headline, could rescue someone drowning in solitude. And in the daily hum of that small-town cafe, their bond was celebrated not with fanfare, but with daily cups of coffee, warm laughter, and the promise that healing was possible whenever compassion bridged the distance between two souls. If you like this story, be sure to give it a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow. And if you enjoy stories that embraces your heart, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this one. Let me know in the comments what stood out to you the most. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.